Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to episode 4.5 of my 5th Video Game Generation retrospective or recap series. If you're watching this in the playlist and wondering why that happened, sorry, I didn't have this console originally when I did the series, so I'm just kind of throwing it in there retroactively. And if you are just enjoying this as a new video, hey, what's up, how you doing? We're going to talk about one of the weirdest, stupidest consoles of all time. Yes, this is the Bandai Playdia, and chances are a lot of you have never heard of it, and I don't blame you, it's not really worth hearing about. And I'm one who defends consoles a lot of the time, and even this one I go like, man. But to be fair, the thing with this console you have to understand is this wasn't meant for you. It wasn't meant for me. This has exactly one demographic it was ever aimed at, and unless you're in that demographic, it's not going to be good for you. This was solely intended for little Japanese kids in 1994. That's it. Since there are no little Japanese kids left in 1994, odds are this doesn't exist for anybody anymore. What I'm saying is everybody grew up, and little Japanese kids now would not care about this. That's what I'm saying. But anyway, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the story of this console, as well as, I guess, the games, and then my experience with it. I'm laughing because it's just, this is a dumb console, guys. Like, the best way I can put this is a less mature and less successful version of the Philips CDI. And I actually defend the CDI. And when I say I defend the CDI, my case for the CDI was, it's not a good video game console, but that's because it's not a video game console. That's like number 6 on its list of goals. It was supposed to be like a movie playback system, a music CD playback system, an educational tool. It was like a bunch of different things. And then last thing on the list was a video game system. This, on the other hand, is the same basic idea, except it kind of was aimed as a video game system. It's just that it doesn't really play or have video games. So here's the story. This was made by Bandai, a company I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. I mostly knew of them growing up as the guys who technically owned Power Rangers, and you would see their logo in front of Power Rangers stuff all the time. It was on a lot of the toys, of course, and that's what Bandai really was, or is a Japanese toy company that dabbles in a whole lot of things, because Japanese companies always do that. But basically, they're no stranger to video games. They weren't at the time that this was released. They had actually been making and being involved with video games going all the way back to the first generation of game consoles. They had been involved with making certain and releasing certain Pong clones throughout Japan, also certain other various consoles that came and went, most of which, including things like the Vectrex, which they actually released over in Japan, was through brand deals. There's a common thing in Japan where a lot of non-Japanese stuff is always considered to be impossible to market there. So what they'll do is they'll have a Japanese company kind of take over and more or less pretend like, hey, this is actually a Japanese thing. The Japanese are kind of not super willing to buy stuff that's not Japanese, so that's a common tradition, and it's still actually around. Like Sega, for example, actually is the distributor and the publisher in a lot of non-Japanese games. Like even as recently as the new Star Wars game, Fallen Order, like that's a Sega released property in Japan. It's a thing. So Bandai would do a lot of that type of stuff by releasing various devices and consoles like the Vectrex and so on and so forth. And they were not strangers to this. Like even when they got up to, say, the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo, like that era, they actually got involved. They made a lot of games that were actually pretty good. And in Japan, for the Super Famicom, they went to Nintendo and they were like, hey, we see that you guys have kind of a chip shortage thing going on here. We want to help you. And they released this thing called a Sufami Turbo. And the Sufami Turbo, I have one. It's pretty neat. It's a Super Famicom cartridge or a Super Nintendo cartridge that had 2 additional cartridge slots on it. And those cartridge slots were essentially entirely new games. You could make Super Nintendo games that fit in there. And the idea was, the reason you would have 2, other than to save on the chips, was also 2 games could be put in simultaneously. You'd play game A, but game B would have additional content if it was compatible with game A. So like an extra character or something like that could appear. Point is, Bandai was creative. Bandai had ideas, and they were not unfamiliar with video games. And in that particular instance, they even got Nintendo's consent, which Nintendo never goes along with stuff like that. So it was just, it's weird. And when you go over to Japan, you ever look in video game stores, you'll see that Bandai has made a ton of random peripherals for game consoles, but they didn't really have a game console to call their own. Enter the Playdia. Now, the thing is, around that time, you have to understand the attitude, which we've talked about throughout this series, and back in the 4th gen as well, was in the 4th generation, there was this belief that Nintendo had proved after the 3rd gen, like, hey, video games are still successful, you can make it. And a lot of the big dogs came back and said, we can do this, and a bunch of new companies got on board and said, we can do this too. The 5th generation was more or less about, like, who's going to win out? Because it could have been anybody. There were so many random companies that got involved. Some companies that came back, other companies that were like, hey, we're true, we're tried and true, we've been around for a long time. I really screwed that up, didn't I? We've been around for a long time, and we can totally make a successful video game console. And other companies that were just like, we're going to give it a shot. Now, obviously, that did eventually work in the form of the Sony PlayStation. But at the time, you got to remember, Sony was in no way associated with video games. The idea that this weird technology company was going to make a super successful console was strange. Why couldn't it be Bandai? Why couldn't it be any of these other guys? But everybody approached it differently. Bandai looked at the situation and went, well, don't really want to go head-to-head with Nintendo because they've been cool to us. We kind of still make stuff for them. And honestly, I don't think we could beat them. They looked at Sega and more or less said the same thing. They looked over at what was laughably would be later be the PCFX, going, hey man, the PC Engine was a huge hit. I don't see why the PCFX won't be, and it wasn't, which we'll talk about in its video eventually. But there was all these companies, they just thought, maybe we can't really go head-to-head with this stuff. So what they ultimately did was say, let's just dip our toe in the pool. Let's see if people like the idea of Bandai being involved with video games. And they said, okay, what we're going to do is play it safe. We're going to make a child-friendly console because that doesn't encroach on the turf of any of these other companies. It's not meant to go head-to-head with any of those guys. It's just meant to see, hey, if we kind of dabble, let's see how audiences respond, see if kids like it, and then maybe our name will be more associated and we can go from there. That's really what it was meant to be. And so on September 23rd, 1994, the 5th entry into the 5th generation came out. Only bested by the Fujitsu FM Towns Marty, the Commodore Amiga CD32, the 3DO, and the Atari Jaguar. This came right after it. And it's not a good game console. Because at the end of the day, all that really happened with this thing was there was ultimately 33, I believe it was 33 titles that came out, every single one of which ultimately published, created, and produced by Bandai, and none of them are actually games. The way I can describe this thing is it's more or less a learning tool and kind of a almost affordable version of a Laserdisc player. And I say Laserdisc, not DVD, very specifically, because it kind of functions like a Laserdisc player as opposed to a DVD player at the time. It was meant to be that type of thing, but more or less for just little kids. Because all of the games were nothing but FMV stuff. Like straight up just FMV. They're just video with a little bit of interactivity. And we'll go over some of the specifics when we get to these games in particular. I keep saying games, but they are really not games when we get to that point. It ultimately, it did okay. For the market it was targeting, it did okay. It was eventually discontinued by 96. Towards the end of its lifespan, Bandai tried to change it up just a little bit. They went a tad more mature, and they started releasing games that were, again, now focused towards adults. And those were like collections of videos of Japanese idol models that you could interact with and stuff like that. And by the end, they didn't really do great with this thing, but they didn't really lose much of anything either. And their appetite for video games was still there. And that led to the decision for them to ultimately work with Apple on the Apple Pippin, which is a video I've already made, yet if you're watching this series in playlist order, hasn't come yet, so it's kind of confusing, but that video will come eventually. But in short, the transition there was, okay, forget the Playdia, we're done with that. What we're going to do is go back to our roots a little bit. Apple, this big technology company, you know them? We're going to work with them. We're going to be the Japanese distributor of the Pippin, and it's going to be able to kick Nintendo's ass and kick Sony's ass and Sega's ass, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that didn't happen. And the reason for that was the Pippin existed in the brief time when Steve Jobs no longer was with Apple, but before he was back with Apple. And that's the only reason it ever was allowed, because the second he came back, he cut the whole project. It survived a little bit longer in Japan only because Bandai's name was behind it, and they kept kind of pushing it because I think they were a little desperate, and they were a little probably pissed. They more or less killed their console to try working on this one, only to have Apple kill that. So I think at that point, their interest in video games got a lot more soured. Now, they weren't done. They did ultimately go on to make the Bandai Wonder Swan, which was a handheld, and they basically poached Gunpei Yokoi away from Nintendo, though after Virtual Boy, that wasn't too hard. Granted, Virtual Boy wasn't his fault, but still, they allowed him to make that, and that was their biggest success when it came to a quality video game console, even though it's not really a console, it's a portable. Platform, let's go with that. A quality video game platform was the Bandai Wonder Swan. I do wonder if this had been slightly more successful, and if they hadn't ever done the deal with Apple and just said, we're not doing that, we'll eventually make our own, I do wonder how well they might have done. You know, they might have come in there, and again, we joke about all these consoles like, oh yeah, Commodore, like the Amiga CD32, like that would never have beat PlayStation or any of these others. But again, you got to remember the time. It could have been anybody. Sony got it right. They did a lot of right things, but there's no reason a company like Bandai couldn't have done it right. They just didn't. And obviously I'm not saying that this thing could have beaten the PlayStation. This thing couldn't beat anybody. But like, again, it wasn't meant to. It's like saying, why didn't the Sega Pico go on to defeat everybody? It's not meant to. It's meant for little kids. Like, it's not an option. But yeah, so that's pretty much it from where it comes to the story of this thing. Now, when it comes to like the hardware aspect of it, you know, like it's hard to say what this thing might actually be capable of as a game console because it doesn't have anything like that. It's kind of like asking what a DVD player might be able to do if you want to build a game for it. And I'm not including the Samsung Nuon, but like a regular DVD player, because more or less this is its own proprietary video format. That's basically what it is. The controller, as you can see here, is just like an infrared controller, like your remote control for your television, and that's just how it interacts. It comes right on there. There's no option to buy a second controller or anything like that. There was no peripherals save for like one Sailor Moon controller of some sort of, just as a wand, but it's essentially exactly the same functionality. There was nothing else to it. It has an open button there so you can put the disc in. Kind of a big, clunky way to put a disc in, but again, that's meant for little kids. A very basic power switch, reset switch, and that's it on there. And then the controller itself, while it appears to have what looks like a D-pad and an A and B button, really, that's not what they are. The D-pad is not really a D-pad. It's a play button, a skip forward, a skip back, and a stop button all on a D-pad. And then the A and B button is just a pause button, and then the B button, I couldn't even find anything that used this. I tried testing every single one of these games just to see like, hey, you know, what might work. But yeah, that's about it. From a hardware perspective, on top of that, it's, you know, on the back, it's just got a very basic 9-volt power supply, as well as native composite out. Funny choice, to be honest. It makes sense at the time. Composite was very standard. Kids understood how to use it. It was no big deal. Better than RF, certainly. But if this whole thing is like, hey man, this is about videos, maybe it should have had S-video. But then you think about it, it's made for little kids. They're probably not going to care too much. So yeah, just composite out on this thing. Now, I have 4 games for it. And again, I keep saying games, but they're not games. I'm going to go through each one of these games because I played each one of them. This one's my favorite. This is not a, again, none of them are games, but this one is actually 2 discs. And the first disc is, the first one is a series of commercials for a very specific line of toys. I forget the name of this thing. It's like Chotsun or something. I'll put the name up there. Chogokin Collection or Selections, sorry. It's literally just commercials, Japanese commercials for one specific line of toys. And it's got some interactive menu on it where you can go in and find the one you want and just watch the trailer for a toy, for a commercial. Okay, and then the second disc is just a music CD, which I probably should have mentioned. That's the only other thing this thing does. It plays music CDs, which is actually hilarious because this thing has no BIOS. It has no dashboard. So when you turn it on, even if you have a disc in it, all you will see is a blue screen. It looks like a blue screen of death. When I first got this thing and powered it up, I was like, oh, I guess it's a brick, because that's all you would see. Because I have never seen a CD-based console that didn't do something when you turned it on. This one does nothing. So I was like, that's weird. And I remember testing it at the time with a music CD, and it worked. I tested with Transformers the movie, the 1986 one. Like, I had a music CD of that. So I'm sitting there listening to it, but I'm looking at this blue screen of death, and I'm like, I wonder if it's like the audio works, but the video doesn't quite work or something like that. No, the video works fine. I found that out literally today as I'm making this video. I was testing all this stuff. I'm like, it actually works. It just has no BIOS of any kind. So with the music CD they provided on this one, it's called Voice Selections. And it just has a bunch of audio, either from the show or from the commercials. I'm not familiar with this brand, so I don't know specifically. But all that happens is if you're playing it on the Playdia, you just hear audio samples of a Japanese guy yelling at you while you're looking at a blue screen. I'm like, what the hell is happening? It's just Japan being Japan. And then the other three that I've got here are the more traditional type of Playdia games. Again, not games. We got 2 Dragon Ball Z ones, as well as a Sailor Moon one. And all they are is just like episodes of the show, as far as I can tell. You have the ability to pause them, stop them, restart them. Like I said, they're basically like very similar to Laserdiscs, but small and for kids. And I know that you keep going, that's a DVD. No, this does not have the functionality of a DVD. This is not as intelligent as a DVD, because sometimes it'll pause, sometimes it'll skip, sometimes it won't. It's not as upgraded as that. It feels a lot more like the skip function on a Laserdisc, where it kind of works sometimes and doesn't quite catch the right moment. I don't know how else to put it. Yeah, it's not good. It's really not good. But sometimes there is some interactivity in there, and I guess at certain times you could choose your own adventure to an extent, and there was a couple of options on how the episode might play out, but really only a little Japanese kid would sit there and, you know, do that. I'm certainly not going to. And as someone who doesn't speak Japanese, like, I truly can get absolutely nothing out of it in that regard. So I tried every single one out, and they're all like that, and that's pretty much it when it comes to the history of this thing. Now, and the games. So my own personal experience with it, beyond what I just described to you, not a whole lot. When I first heard about this console, I was like, oh, that's stupid. Like, I don't really, like, it's one of those things where, like, sure, I'll get one someday if it's, like, cheap enough. But I never really thought I would own it, because the price they go for was way more than I was willing to pay, and it's just not something I was that interested in pursuing. So what ended up happening is, last year, at the time I make this video, I was in Japan in a hard off with my buddy Fox, and it's like a hardware store. They call it a hardware store, but really they sell a lot of video games and all sorts of random electronics. And he ended up finding this in the box, and he just showed it to me. He's like, here you go. And I was like, whoa, you found a Bandai Playdia? He's like, I know. And we opened it up, we looked at it, it was in beautiful condition, and it actually still has this thing we found on it, which was a sticker that says number 12, which I'm going to speculate why I think that's there in a minute, but we'll get back to that. But yeah, it still had the box, the power supply, everything. The original paperwork for it, like, it was basically untouched. And it was only $40. And I was like, am I an idiot for getting it, or am I an idiot for passing on it? Which makes me dumber? Because neither is smart. Both are just dumb, which is just the lesser of two dumb. So I ended up getting it because, financially speaking, that was a much better deal than I was ever going to see for it. And really, honestly, I got it A, for collector's reasons, but B, just so this video could exist. That's really it. After that, I brought it back here, and like I said, I tried it out. I played a music CD, and that was really all I could do with it. The controller itself uses 2 AAA batteries. It's obviously not rechargeable. It's not wired in any way. It is a remote control for a television. That is what it is, except it's specifically for this one particular console. Now, the only other thing there really is to note about this console is after it was done and they couldn't sell them, they used the extra units in like pop-up devices for people to like watch little movie clips and stuff. They more or less were just treated as video playback systems, which is why I speculate mine has this sticker on it. We think this was some sort of demo unit either for that purpose or this was like in a toy store or something, the one they just kept out on display, because it doesn't really make much sense else to have this sticker on it. So we left it on there. He convinced me to leave it on because that's like part of its history. But beyond that, I have no other way of tracking down what it ever was. But since it's in such immaculate condition, I'm guessing that no kid ever really owned this, and it was probably never really used. And the fact that it has literally no problem whatsoever playing discs, like I didn't have to clean it, I didn't do anything. Like it's flawless. So it's a flawless, glittering piece of garbage. That's really what it is. But still a cool thing to own nonetheless. It's kind of a shame that this is really the only console, home console, aside from the WonderSwan, which is not a home console, that Bandai ever really truly like tried. And it's a shame because I do feel that with the IPs they had, especially at that point in time, having like pretty much, if they wanted it to, they could have had exclusive access to Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which was a juggernaut at that point in time. They probably could have made something, but they just weren't really willing to try. And I mean, maybe that was the right call. They didn't end up losing a ton of money on this thing. It's possible they put out like some serious competitor that it could have just absolutely flopped. Or who knows, maybe these days we wouldn't be talking about Sony. We'd be talking about Bandai and not the PlayStation, but their version of it. You know, some major console that they had gone on to make. So who knows? But certainly this was not going to do it. This console in of itself was not going to be a juggernaut of success. But that's about it. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you could like, comment, subscribe, and all that stuff, I'd super appreciate that. Check out all the social description stuff for Twitter, Instagram, all that. I appreciate that as well. Enjoy the rest of the series. There will be actually new episodes added retroactively as well. So thank you again, and I'll see you all later.